can just multiply by the quantities and prices there, and we can turn those into elasticities. Right? Okay. So the final thing is that if we have a discrete change in taxes, we can derive the effect that that has on welfare by just integrating up the local changes in taxes, right? Because a discrete change in tax is just the integral of a bunch of local changes in tax. And so the incidence, the ratio of how much borne by consumers to producers for discrete tax, is just the average pass-through rate, where average is defined as being weighted by quantities, right? Because that's how much at any point people are bearing is proportional to quantities. So the incidence of a discrete tax is just going to be given by the incidence formula, where the pass-through rates are replaced by the quantity-weighted average pass-through rates between the initial tax and the final tax. Now, if we raise a tax to infinity, from 0 to infinity, we're going to destroy the market, right? If the tax is infinity, no one's going to trade. So we can always think of the average pass-through rate between those 2 points as being the value of creating the market, right? So the incidence, the split of total consumer surplus to total producer surplus, is just going to be the incidence of a tax going from 0 to infinity. So if we define the average pass-through rate as just being the this average pass-through rate going from 0 to infinity, then the ratio of consumer to producer surplus is just the average pass-through rate over 1 minus the average pass-through rate. And so one way of thinking about this is when we put a tax on a market, the person who bears that tax, the side that bears that tax, is the side that's benefiting from the market existing in the first place. If the elasticity of demand is high and the elasticity of supply is low, then the people who benefit from the market existing in the first place are the suppliers. If the elasticity of supply is high and the elasticity of demand is low, then the people who benefit from the market existing are the consumers. And so, you know, our intuitive sense when we say, oh, the consumers are going to bear the tax, we say, oh, poor consumers. Well, that's because they're benefiting from the market existing in the first place. So the people who are harmed by the tax on a market are those who benefit from the market's existence. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you're going to answer this question.
Yeah.
It's not a very precise question.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how the working out of the average pass-through rate implies the conclusion you just came to.
Okay, so basically what happens is you integrate up these local changes, right? And what you get is you get the ratio of sort of this integral of the pass-through rate times the quantity on the top, and you get the integral of 1 minus the pass-through rate times the quantity on the bottom. So if you then replace that integral with the average times the quantity and then cancel the quantities on the top and the bottom, you get the conclusion. Yeah. Okay. So this tells us what the split of the gains from international trade are going to be, right? Because if we say what's the ratio of consumer to producer surplus, that tells us how much does a country that's importing a good benefit relative to the country that's exporting from the fact that trade is possible, right? But now a question is, what are the sources of gains from trade in the first place, right? Why does trade benefit anyone at all, right? And international trade is the same as trade between two people. I mean, all these things are basically the same. So we could talk about trade within a country. We could talk about trade within a village. Talk about trade across two individuals. All of these are going to follow basically the same principles. And in fact, when I talk about international trade, I'll be moving back and forth between examples drawn from like your personal life trading with people nearby and examples drawn from countries trading, because they all follow the same basic ideas. And the key concept is its heterogeneity of various forms that makes trade valuable. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, one form of heterogeneity that might exist is what drives trade in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which is heterogeneity in preferences compared to endowments. And Eric, could you explain how heterogeneity generates trade in the Heckscher-Ohlin model?
So I haven't read that specific paper, but my guess would be that heterogeneity essentially, like, effectively, like, you can view it as there's more sub-markets that, like, each different, like, the heterogeneous preferences, you know, have, like, different markets for each
Yeah.
consumer.
Yeah, so the idea is that if I like apples and you have apples and you like oranges and I have oranges, then there's a lot of gain to be gained from the fact that we're heterogeneous, because I can trade you the apples for my oranges and we're both better off. So if we both had the same endowments and the same preferences, right, or if our endowments were perfectly correlated with their preferences, there would be no benefits to trade. So trade comes from the heterogeneity in the relative allocation of preferences versus endowments to different people. And that's one potential model of international trade. So different countries could be endowed with different things relative to what their preferences are. Either they have, say, different preferences but the same endowments, or they could have different endowments but the same preferences, or any combination of those, and that'll generate benefits from trade. Yeah, James?
Do we, I mean, that can all come off the endowments and not,
Yeah.
preferences can be identical, right? So like, China's got lots of labor and
Yeah.
not much capital, and America's got lots of capital and not much labor, and so America does all the capital intensive
Exactly.
work and China does all the labor
Yeah.
intensive work.
Yeah, so exactly. Preferences can differ and endowments can be the same. Endowments can differ and preferences can be the same, or any sort of combination of thereof. It's really in the ratio sort of preferences to endowments that has to be heterogeneous to generate benefits from trade. Okay, so let me give you an example where he just gave an example where only endowments differ and preferences are the same. Let me give you an example where only preferences differ and endowments are the same. So in that case, think about people who have different degrees of risk aversion. And you take the risks off me because I'm less risk averse than you are. That's a case where only preferences differ and endowments are the same. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
What's the difference between his example and like specialization? Because he said it was literally their like endowment of labor versus capital, and he was saying one person's going to do what they're
Well, they specialize. Specialization is a broader term. Specialization can occur even when, well, I'm going to give you an example where specialization occurs where there are no differences between people at all. So,
so the same endowment of like capital and labor,
but they just specialize in one thing or the other. And that could still be beneficial if there are economies of scale. So we'll talk about that in a second. But specialization is a broader concept. But effectively, all this heterogeneity is exactly specialization. It's like I do one thing, you do the other. That's exactly what I mean by heterogeneity. Okay, so Smith, Krugman, and Mellitz. Mike, could you explain to me what their idea of the reasons for international trade or trade are?
I don't really recall either, sorry. But specialization, I mean, kind of.
Do you know Smith's pin factory example?
Yes.
So can you describe that?
Each individual does a different little activity.
And that has nothing to do with the fact that people are heterogeneous, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's the same, basically. They're all just workers, but somehow they specialize in a given task, right?
So putting in, and I remember he kind of talked about when you put in time into that action, you get better at it. You kind of specialize by doing it.
Yeah,
more.
that's the learning by doing story. That's an economy of scale over time, right? So if we have economies of scale over time, then even if people are homogeneous, they can be ex post heterogeneous. So we can all choose to become heterogeneous if there's economies of scale to reap gains from trade, right? So the most classic example of trade in economics, the pin factory example, the beginning of the Wealth of Nations, is exactly this model of endogenous economies of scale driven specialization. And that was formalized, my God, in the 1980s by Paul Krugman. And he said that people are ex ante similar, but they specialize, right? Finally, another model is Ricardo's, in which there are different technologies. Is John Zwick here? Yeah, John, what is Ricardo's model of international trade?
I didn't read the paper, but
Come on, you must have learned in intermediate comparative advantage.
different technologies. I don't know. You'll have one location will have technology that it gives them efficiency in one particular field, so
Yeah.
that helps to have them specialize in making maybe Apple computers versus
Yeah.
chips or something.
Yeah, so that's the theory of comparative advantage. It's like the one that you guys learn the most about, probably, right? That's like, this country is better at making this, and this country is better at making that. They're going to specialize in doing those things. It's the heterogeneity in their technologies for doing things that make them better or worse, right? Yeah, Neil.
Mathematically, how do we look at number 2? Like I can see, you explain to me, like number 3 is going to be our production function, and number 1 is going to be our different, bundles that are different utility functions.
Yeah.
What is number 2? How
Mathematically?
Does that manifest, like in terms of our?
Well, so that's why it took until the 1980s to formalize it. So the usual version is you have some like production function that views different goods as complementary, and then each individual has a like declining marginal cost of production. And so if we each specialize in producing one of the complementary inputs to the final production, then we're going to get more production than if each of us produces many different things.
Sure. But somehow we have to be breaking a good, right? Like you can make like one good myself.
Oh no, but then you can have a continuous output of the good. So you can have these be complementary inputs to making some continuous good, and then we each get paid because they're complementary inputs, but it's a declining marginal cost of doing the thing. The amount that I get paid for any amount of production is still some price, right? But then I'm going to try to produce myself only in one area so that I get the most output, right? Which is, I think, that's Krugman's formalization. Actually, he has a monopolistic element to it. But anyways, that's not really that important. But that's Krugman's formalization of the Smith pin factory model, and he applies it to international trade. Okay, so each of this tells us interesting things. And in fact, the Krugman thing is on your syllabus, so you can read that if you want to see how he does it. Okay, so I think each of these models of international trade tells us some quite interesting things. So I'm going to try to go through some of the things that each of the model tells us. Okay, so first let's think about the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So imagine that different countries have the same demand, but the US has a bunch of farms and just exogenously, and China has a bunch of factories just exogenously, right? So then farm goods are going to be cheap relative to manufactured goods in the United States and vice versa in China, right? Now, if we start to trade, prices will end up in the middle between those two prices, right? And that's going to hurt manufacturers in the United States, and it's going to hurt farmers in China, right? Even though it's going to benefit the manufacturers in China and the farmers in the US more. So broadly, if technology is the same and there's no economies of scale, there's always going to be overall gains from trade, but the scarce factor is always going to lose because the prices move in the opposite direction for them, right? So this is called the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. It says anytime there's trade, there's overall gains when there's these factor changes, but the owners of the scarce factor are going to lose as a result. Now we could compensate them, but the problem with compensating people for this is they could deliberately try to make themselves scarce or make themselves look scarce so that they get compensated, and that could lead to strategic protectionism and all sorts of stuff that people do just in order to get these compensation. And I think that's a lot of the reason why we don't compensate trade as much as economists say you would, because the gains that you could get thinking beforehand about making yourself scarce or something like that would be too great. So as a result, people end up not getting compensated and therefore opposing trade, and there's inefficiencies as a result of that. Yeah, go ahead, James.
So I'm just trying to think about this in terms of American labour going from China from America.
Yeah.
And the Stolper-Samuelson theorem says the labour is going to be worse off, assuming that they're the scarce factor.
Yeah.
But is that kind of not taking into account that they're also